Good morning and welcome everyone to the virtual WUI Day at the Capitol program. I think we have an interesting program for you this morning. We'll begin with an overview of recent legislation, followed by a discussion of renewable resources and the development of renewable energy in our state. And then we're going to bring in the chairs of the legislature's energy committees. So in lieu of being able to have face-to-face meetings with our legislature, we're going to bring them to you. Some of the materials that we've provided include an issue briefing paper, and then postcards that you can send to your legislators. Because we aren't able to meet face-to-face, we thought it would be important to have some mechanism to remind legislators that we are constituents and that we do care about energy issues. So the postcards are an opportunity to just, again, put the WUI face in front of the state legislature. We also have included a legislative directory, which lists all of the members of the state Senate and Assembly, the Public Service Commission, Congress, and others. And if you need help identifying who your legislator is, you can go to the WUI website, which is located there at the bottom of the legislative directory, and you'll get help identifying who your legislator is. The mission of the Wisconsin utility investors is really to protect the interests of investors in the legislature, before the Public Service Commission and other governmental agencies. Government does a lot of things that affect our investments, that affect the companies. And our job is to stay on top of that, keep you informed about what's going on in the Capitol and at the PSC and elsewhere, and then to advocate on behalf of the investor community, and to encourage you as an individual investor to participate in the process by calling or writing, otherwise communicating with your elected representatives on critical energy issues that will affect your investments. This session, the legislature started in January. The session runs for 2 years. And what that means is that there's a cycle in which bills are introduced, and anything that doesn't pass at the end of the 2 years is dead for the session and has to be reintroduced the following 2-year session. The session schedule basically is they come into a period of time when they vote on bills on the floor of the legislature from roughly January till the passage of the budget at the end of June in the first year of the biennium, which is the year that we're in right now. Then they come back, then they break for the rest of the summer. They come back in September for a series of fall floor periods where again, they vote on individual bills. And then again, in the second year of the biennium, they start in January and run through March or April, depending on the session, at which point they adjourn and go back home and run for re-election. So that's the rough schedule for a legislative session. Right now, they're in the middle of budget deliberations, which is something that takes a good bit of their time and energy, and becomes almost a complete focus of the legislature in the month of June, which is where we're at right now. That bill is likely to pass by the end of June. That's the end of the biennial budget period. So they need a budget to start taxing and spending for the next 2 years. In addition to dealing with the budget, they've also been voting on bills that really address various aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic, anything ranging from how to spend the federal money to what to do with the unemployment system. They've also been passing bills that involve election reforms. Many of these bills have been vetoed by the governor, however. The legislature is controlled by the Republican Party in both houses. And of course, the governor is a Democrat, and there is quite a bit of difference in their views on many of these kinds of issues. At the same time, there's been very few energy issues that have come before the legislature, with perhaps one notable exception. Okay. With respect to the state budget, that basically is a massive bill that deals with the taxing and spending for the state for the 2-year period. And it also includes a substantial amount of policy that is primarily the proposals that the governor wants to get across that come from the various state agencies. The bill is almost 2,000 pages long, so you can imagine it has a lot of individual issues embedded in it. In its original form, as introduced by the governor, it raises taxes by a net of about $1 billion. It increases fees by a net of about $17 million and includes a total spending figure for the biennium of $93 billion. This will all be substantially modified by the legislature before it finally passes the bill. In fact, it looks as though they're going to actually cut taxes rather than raise them and cut spending from the governor's original proposal. At the end of the process, the governor gets to exercise a line item veto, so there will be changes even after the legislature is done before the bill is signed into law. As far as energy issues go, as the governor introduced the bill, there were quite a few proposals relating to energy and utilities. Among them was a proposal to increase the contribution rate for an entity called Focus on Energy, which is supposed to promote energy efficiency in Wisconsin. Presently, 1.2% of gross revenues for utilities are paid into the Focus on Energy program. It amounts to about $100 million. These are monies that are essentially paid by ratepayers. The governor was proposing increasing that to 2.4%, which would raise an additional $100 million, making the program total roughly $200 million. Another issue that was included was a proposal to have the Public Service Commission consider the social cost of carbon when approving generation facilities or transmission lines. A fairly substantial new regulatory wrinkle. And another issue that the governor proposed was increasing fines for pipeline safety violations from $25,000 to $200,000 per violation, which is a per day situation. And it would have capped those fines at $2 million. Presently, the cap is $500,000. Substantial increase in penalties for what are often, fairly minor violations. As it turns out, the legislature's Joint Finance Committee, which reworks the budget before it goes in front of the full House and Senate, removed these items from the budget, and as well as all of most of the other energy-related matters. And it's likely that the bill in its final form won't include any of these proposals when it finally passes and is ultimately signed by the governor. Another bill that was developed and passed in the legislature is a PSC update legislation, and this is something that's been done now for a couple of sessions. It's basically a process whereby the utilities and the Public Service Commission and the chairs of the energy committees get together and try to figure out modest changes, for the most part, that will improve the regulatory process, streamline the process, and it's more or less an agreed on bill and usually has no trouble passing the legislature as a result. It was introduced late last session and it just didn't quite make it through because of the end of the session cutoff. So it was reintroduced this session and passed both houses and was signed by the governor. The bill in its final form eliminated various unnecessary filings and updated various obsolete thresholds that were in the law, adjusted some of the PSC procedures to improve the process, and probably most significantly provided a permanent funding source for the Citizens Utility Board, a group that advocates on behalf of consumers and helps ensure that the record that the PSC considers when it decides rate cases is a complete record that reflects both the input from the utilities as well as the perspective of consumers. Again, this bill was passed and signed into law as Act 29. WUI was involved in lobbying in support of that legislation. The last issue I want to talk about is proposals that deal with renewable deregulation. There are proposals that are likely to be introduced shortly that deregulate third-party ownership of solar generation, and also deregulate community solar projects. Basically what this is about is saying that entities that are third-party entities, non-utility entities, can develop solar generation and be free from the kind of regulation that utilities are subject to. And this is a concern. This would result in no PSC oversight over these facilities, and yet would require the utilities to distribute electricity from the facilities and buy excess electricity back from its third-party entities. Again, this legislation is likely to be introduced shortly into the legislature. The issues and problems with this set of proposals includes the potential for cross-subsidization. In other words, individuals that choose to have solar energy facilities and or these companies that build solar energy facilities could be subsidized by virtue of the fact that the distribution network necessary to distribute this energy is still owned by the utilities and is subject to their rate regulation structure, so that individuals that really have no connection to these new solar projects will wind up paying for the distribution system that serves those solar facilities. In addition, these solar facilities would have no rate regulation. They would be subject to no rate regulation as a normal utility is, which again is potentially of concern, I think, to consumers. And there would be no maintenance and reliability requirements imposed on them as there are on regular utilities that are subject to PSC oversight. They would have unfettered ability to exploit and use the electrical grid, which I think has some potential for reliability concerns. And at the end of the day, utility scale solar facilities are the most cost-effective way to generate solar electricity, as opposed to having individual distributed solar facilities. By far, it is cheaper to do it on a utility scale than to have solar facilities on people's houses. In addition, Wisconsin's utilities all have extensive programs and provide various options for individuals to purchase solar energy, to install solar facilities on their property if they would like, that have a more organized and reliable connection to the existing energy infrastructure of our state. So those are some bills that I think that we're going to have to follow closely and probably ask you to weigh in on at some point in the future as they wind their way through the legislature. With that, we're going to turn to the first of our speakers. Today we have with us Farah Mandich from Xcel Energy Resources. She's a resource planning specialist, and she's going to talk about renewable energy and the various issues that are embedded in the whole issue of advancing renewable generation in Wisconsin and elsewhere. Farah is actually from Minnesota. She's operates out of their Minnesota headquarters. She's been with the company for 2 years, but she has 10 years of experience in the utility field. And she has a master's degree from University of Michigan, and has got a lot of background with renewables and renewable planning and on behalf of Xcel Energy. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Farah for her presentation. Thank you, Farah, for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. So bear with me for 1 second while I get the presentation up. Okay. Can you guys all see that? Or can someone confirm that you can see it?
Yes, we're looking
Great.
good.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. Well, yeah, thanks again for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you today about resource planning and responsibly managing the energy transition. I'm also really excited to talk to a group of people that invest in Wisconsin companies. I'm originally from Green Bay, and my family has a long history with utilities in Wisconsin. And my mom worked at Wisconsin Public Service when I was growing up. So really, really excited to talk to you today. So what I'm going to focus on today is discussing how we do integrated resource planning. And this is really how we set a generation roadmap for the next 10 to 15 years for the company. And within that, talk about how we balance all of these various objectives that we're trying to meet. So the company has really ambitious carbon reduction goals, but we also think that affordability and reliability are extremely important, and we need to balance all of those things when we're doing our planning. So I will go ahead and jump right in. And I'm gonna leave some time at the end for questions. And I know that you all have access to a chat, but I don't think I can see it right now. So I'm gonna present this and then we can go back through any slides that people have questions about at the end. So just to give you a little bit of an overview of Xcel, in the upper Midwest, we actually have 2 utilities with an integrated service area. So we have an operating company in Wisconsin and Michigan, and an operating company that serves Minnesota and parts of North and South Dakota. We do integrated resource planning for the whole upper Midwest together. So in Wisconsin specifically, we have about 280,000 electric and or gas customers. For the whole upper Midwest, we have about 1.8 million electric customers. So that's who I, when me and my team do resource planning, that's who we're planning for. We're part of the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator market area. So that's the MISO market helps kind of balance generation and plan transmission. So we're part of that market. But within that market, we have a diverse set of generation resources. So we have just about every fuel type you could think of: coal, gas, nuclear, wind, hydro, solar, biomass, across all 5 states. In Wisconsin, a lot of our resources, we have a pretty good number of hydro resources. We also have some natural gas resources, biomass, and recently more solar. And as I said before, we have a company-wide commitment to achieving really ambitious carbon reduction goals. So our goal is to reduce our carbon emissions 80% below 2005 levels by 2030, and then be 100% carbon-free by 2050. So when we think about resource planning, like I said, resource planning is sort of the way that we set our roadmap for what type of electricity generation resources we're going to use to serve our customers in the future. And so typically what that means is we're really doing an economic assessment of our system and determining the size, type, and timing of least cost sets of future resources that we want to use to serve our customers. And that looks 15 years into the future. So, when we think about planning and when we submit this to the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission, which is the primary regulatory body that requires this plan of us, we're doing planning 15 years into the future, but we focus on the first 5 years increments for what they actually will approve us going to pursue. And that's important because, I think especially now, whereas before the utility industry didn't move that quickly and things didn't change very much, change is, accelerating now. So new technologies are coming available, the costs are coming down really fast. And so what we thought was the most economic solution 5 years ago might not be the most economic solution now. And so that's why, it's really important to be working on these resource plans continually and evaluating new technologies and all of those types of things. And so, as I said before, we really are trying to balance for core objectives when we do this resource planning. We're balancing, obviously, our environmental goals. We want to maintain affordability for customers, and we're also balancing risk and reliability for customers. So, reliable service is essentially the bedrock of utilities. If we don't have reliable service, we may as well not be in business. And so it's really important to us to make sure that what we're planning is meeting all four of those objectives and balancing them appropriately, even when sometimes they, there's pressure on one when you prioritize the other. So just to give you a little bit of an overview of what our latest plan indicates. So we are planning to retire all of our coal resources by 2030. We have about 2,400 megawatts of coal on the system right now, primarily at 2 locations. So both of them are in Minnesota. And we are planning to take all of those units offline by 2030. We are planning to add about 5,700 megawatts of new renewable generation, which is primarily wind and solar. And this is, it's interesting because the company has added a significant amount of wind resources already over the past, 5 to 7 years. But we are starting now to think about adding solar as those costs are coming down, and it's becoming economically viable in the upper Midwest. We also have nuclear resources. So we are talking about extending one of our nuclear units from 2030 to 2040. And then we're planning to operate the other 2 units through at least the end of their current license lives in the early 2030s. And I think, we really see the value in nuclear generation. It's very stable, base load and zero emission resource. And so we'll be reevaluating whether or not we want to try to extend the other 2 units as well, probably in our next resource plan. And then the last 2 components, in terms of firm dispatchable resources, what we really mean by firm dispatchable is, right now those resources are gas combustion turbines. So those are really fast response resources that can help balance renewables and support load when the renewables are not available. So right now those are powered by gas. In the future, we think that there will be other technologies and opportunities, different fuels and that kind of thing to be able to reduce the carbon emissions associated with those resources. But having firm dispatchable resources on our system is a really core piece of our plan. And then finally, we do invest quite a bit in demand side management. So we have pretty ambitious goals to increase our annual energy efficiency savings and then add about 400 megawatts of demand response relative to where we are today. So we have a lot of plans to work on retiring our highest emitting resources and replacing them with clean generation, but still maintaining affordability and reliability when we're doing that. So in terms of what this plan achieves, we do see that the plan retiring our coal units and adding significant renewables really increases the amount of carbon-free generation on our system. So by 2034, we see this plan getting us to about 75% carbon-free generation overall. But we're doing that, affordably and responsibly. So we have a really high priority on keeping customer bills affordable. We believe that, especially because the industry is moving toward electrification and doing a lot of other things, making sure that residential bills are affordable is a really important priority for us. And in particular, that they stay below the national average and they grow slower than the national average. So that's, kind of what we're 2 goals that we're aiming to meet with our plan as well. So the last couple of slides here, I want to talk a little bit about risk and reliability. I know that the winter event in Texas has been top of everybody's mind in the industry and honestly just in the general public. Making sure that our energy supply is reliable. And so I think we achieve that through, at least three. These are probably kind of the three primary practices that I think are really important to ensuring that our plan is responsible in managing customer risk. And so this gets a little bit detailed, but just I think it's important to understand. So when we do resource planning, we take a fixed resource adequacy planning approach. So that means that we are planning to add resources that meet our full customer capacity needs for customer demand, plus a planning reserve margin that MISO tells us. And what's really important about that is, there are some resources like coal and gas that will get a resource adequacy value that are approximately the same as their installed capacity. So if you have a 200 megawatt plant, you're going to get almost 200 megawatts of what they call firm capacity out of that. But the MISO constructs reflect for renewables that those resources aren't necessarily going to be available every hour of every day. And the accredited capacity or the firm capacity of those resources is discounted accordingly. So we take all of that into account when we're planning to make sure that we're not relying too much on renewables to meet customer needs when those resources may not be available every hour of every day. So that's one approach. The second approach is that our economic modeling is pretty detailed and takes into account system needs on an hourly basis. And that's a new practice. We've kind of been shifting from kind of old resource planning to new resource planning as we get more variable renewable generation resources on the grid. But what the hourly modeling does, as opposed to historical modeling that was a little bit more high level, is make sure that we're looking at, when customer load increases in the afternoon during, like 3 to 7 or so, whatever the peak hours are, that we're planning to have resources that can meet customer needs in every hour of every day. And so if the wind resource isn't necessarily going to always be available at that time, the model is taking that into account. And then the last thing I would say is that after we conduct economic modeling, we're doing additional reliability and risk analysis to make sure that, the model, because the model has to make simplifying assumptions, we're stress testing that portfolio. So we do additional reliability tests, test more extreme weather than maybe is kind of the average that's put into the model. And then we examine kind of the portfolio on resource diversity, making sure we have lots of different types of resources that hopefully, won't encounter outages or low periods of production all at once. And then also really important for the upper Midwest, making sure that the resources that we have are available to meet winter peaks. And I think all of that goes into just a general principle is that good planning supports really good operational outcomes during an extreme event like what happened in Texas. So we think that our planning process is pretty robust to those types of things. And I'm not a grid operator, so I don't have all the details on this, but my understanding is that our system performed fairly well during the winter event that we experienced in February. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of how we evaluate this, one of the sort of screening tests that we do for risk and reliability is to examine, what are firm resource, so base load and like nuclear, gas, coal, resources and hydro look like relative to our overall peak demand. And there's a lot of bars in this chart, but what you're seeing is, these are 15 different plans that we evaluated in our resource planning process. And the orange one is the plan that we proposed. And what this is showing is that, we have a priority on maintaining a pretty high ratio of firm resources to peak load. Because from a risk perspective, we're in the MISO market, so we don't necessarily have to always have generation resources to cover our load, because we can buy from the market. So, but we take a fixed resource planning adequacy approach because, there could be outages on our for resources in our system and other systems in our region at the same time. And so we want to make sure that we have at least, you know, a certain amount of firm resources to meet customer needs. And so, you know, the MISO market enables some efficiencies, but we want to make sure that we're hedging appropriately to ensure that we don't put our customers at risk, either financially or from a reliability perspective. And then, you know, I think the important thing here is that as we start to integrate more renewable resources onto our system, we just need to really make sure that the planning standards at MISO are keeping up with that. So ensuring that we're considering, you know, for example, solar, its ability to contribute to peak load really in every season, because it, you know, on average will produce different amounts of energy in the winter versus in the summer. So those are the types of things that we think about when we're planning the system. You know, we think that we can integrate a whole bunch of renewables on the system without compromising customer reliability and affordability. And so, yeah, that's kind of the process we use for planning. So I will stop there. That was a lot, but I'm happy to take questions.
Farah, for that excellent presentation. And we have questions from any of our participants at this point? I've got a few questions, I guess. When you're establishing carbon reduction goals, you had an 80% by 2030 and 100% eventually. Does gas figure into that calculation in terms of gas, you know, distribution for home heating, for example?
So it doesn't factor into the calculations for our electric system. I do know that our gas distribution system has goals to reduce the carbon intensity of that of those resources. I don't have a ton of details on that because that's kind of outside the scope of where I work, but I know that we proposed a lower carbon fuel kind of proposal in Colorado recently in our Colorado operating company. And then, you know, in Minnesota, I've heard, and I know that, you know, different utilities are working on different things, but I've heard that one of the gas utilities in Minnesota is thinking about trying to incorporate more renewable gas. So like from, you know, with cow waste and that kind of thing. So that's definitely on our radar. And I know that the company is working on trying to incorporate that as well.
Another thing that crossed my mind is your retirement of your coal plants. Are these running to the end of their useful life at this point, or are they being sort of prematurely retired? And if so, how are you financing that, I guess?
Yep. Yeah. So we are proposing them to retire before the end of their financial lives. When we did our resource planning evaluation, we start with assessing different combinations of baseload unit retirements. So essentially testing, is it economic to retire this plant early? And we found that it actually was. So our scenario that we proposed to the Minnesota Commission proposes to retire, you know, so our units are retiring one is retiring in 2023 and one is retiring in 2026, which was approved in our last resource plan. And we're proposing to retire one of the remaining units about 4 years early and the other one 10 years early. And we found that actually in our economic modeling, it was more efficient economically to depreciate those assets faster and retire them by 2030.
You know, some people have discussed that the use of securitization, sort of separate securitization of those assets in a separate stream of revenue from rates to pay them off. Mm-hmm. Have you had to resort to anything like that, as far as you know?
So not in the upper Midwest. I think we are contemplating that in other jurisdictions, but in the Minnesota resource plan, or just generally for the upper Midwest, we haven't proposed that.
Another thing that struck me was the slide that showed that you were going to get to 58% of the generating capacity from renewables by 2030, I believe. And it begs the question again, on a windless night, when you're not getting any solar or any wind generation, how do you make up the difference? And I think you've kind of covered it, but maybe you could re-emphasize that.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. It's something we think about a lot. So, from a reliability perspective, because we are in the MISO market, we do have access to, purchasing electricity from other areas if we get to a point where sort of the resources that we plan to serve our customers aren't producing. And it's not universally the case that geographic diversity will sort of level out some of those issues. Like if the wind's not blowing here, it might be blowing in North Dakota or Illinois or Iowa or somewhere else. It doesn't always work out that way, but a lot of times it will. And so, if it's a really hot summer day and the wind's not blowing, we think a combination of conservation and using the resources we do have, the firm dispatchable resources we do have on our system, keeping the nuclear plants operating really well, appropriately hedges customer risk in that situation. I think where we really want to make sure that we're covered really well is in the winter, because I think the consequences, especially in the upper Midwest, are just higher if you kind of lose power in the winter in some sense. And so, that's why from a planning perspective, we wouldn't plan a system, and actually MISO wouldn't allow us to retire plants if they thought it was going to cause a reliability issue. But from a customer risk hedging perspective, cost risk, we want to make sure that we have enough dispatchable generation on the system at this point to cover our winter peaks for sure. Because that is, during the Texas event, when you see a situation where power prices are through the roof, we are, maybe having to purchase electricity. And some of those times we're also selling into the market. And so those risks balance out a little bit. So that's kind of how we think about, making sure that we're appropriately planning for those types of events.
Another thing that I thought maybe you could touch on is the potential for battery storage. I know some companies, other companies in Wisconsin are planning to install some battery storage with their next development of solar generation. And I'm wondering, if you've looked at that or have contemplated installing some battery storage as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in our economic optimization, we don't see as many batteries getting selected through that economic modeling, at least at this point. I think we will probably, as costs come down, we'll probably see that happen more in the future. But having said that, I do think for solar resources where you are getting, peak generation is like just before the peak of customer demand. I think having batteries attached to those systems is really valuable. And I think that's something that we're continually evaluating when we think about installing solar resources on our system.
The other thing that perhaps you could elaborate on for us is what did happen in Texas. I think a lot of people were told that it was a function of too much reliance on renewables, but I think the reality was somewhat different than that. If you could just maybe, if you're familiar with it anyway, touch on what exactly did go wrong down there.
Yeah, I can definitely talk a little bit about that. So I think everything that could go wrong did go wrong, frankly, in Texas. you know, from what I understand, they had about 26 to 30 gigawatts of unexpected outages on their gas units, which is massive. You know, from every possible reason to, you know, the plant's not being weatherized, to the gas supply not being weatherized, and so they couldn't get adequate gas resources. You know, there are a whole confluence of issues. And so, you know, if from the ISO's perspective, from ERCOT, or, you know, from MISO here, if you are planning to have, you know, you're thinking you're going to have, I think, you know, something like 60 gigawatts of load and 90 gigawatts of resources, and your load ends up being higher than you forecasted, and your resources end up being significantly lower than you're forecasted, then you're in a bad situation. So I think the forced outages on the gas units were a huge contributor to that situation. You know, the wind assets obviously weren't performing very much, but I think going back to the sort of resource adequacy framework that I touched on a little bit, they're also not actually expected to contribute to capacity very much in the winter. I don't know exactly what the accreditation factor is in Texas, but in MISO, for example, it's about 17%. So that means that you know, we're expecting from a capacity adequacy perspective that wind resource to carry load equivalent to about 17% of its installed capacity. So wind is really more of an energy resource. And so in a winter event like that, we're not actually expecting it to contribute a lot of load carrying capability. And so, you know, the wind, I don't know if it was kind of lower than expected. I think it was probably about average, or maybe even outperformed expectations a little bit. But really, I think the winterization of the dispatchable assets was really a much you know, more significant factor in that event than, you know, wind being less available than was expected.
I guess as I understood it, the fact that they don't winterize their actual generation facilities and the distribution of natural gas to those facilities was also disrupted, which is what caused the big price spike around the country. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that was a large contributing factor. And I actually saw a really interesting video that Wisconsin Energy put out, kind of talking about what a gas plant looks like in Wisconsin versus what it looks like in Texas. And in Texas, you can see all of the pipes and infrastructure are all open to the air, which is, you know, not something we would do here, obviously, because it freezes in the winter all the time. So yeah, I think from a weatherization perspective, that was a really interesting thing, because I didn't actually realize that they didn't weatherize their plants at all. On average, you know, some people will. Yeah, that wasn't something that I realized before the event happened.
Shifting gears a little bit, you know, we're seeing a growth in electric cars and trucks. That's definitely something that's coming. You know, we assume that's going to have a significant impact on demand. Have you been planning for that, or have any forecasts about that, or plans to address that?
Yeah, yep, we do actually incorporate electrification forecasts into sort of our baseline load growth expectations. Obviously, it could grow faster than we're projecting, and I think that's so there's two ways we can address that through planning. One is we do a lot of sensitivity analyses on different levels of load and technology prices, and so you know, we are evaluating what it would look like if we had a significant ramp up in electrification. The other important thing is that we do evaluate our resource plans fairly regularly, you know, at least every 5 years, but usually in shorter timeframes than that. And so, you know, if we saw a significant uptake of electrification, which we hope we do, then we would, you know, want to reevaluate our load forecasts and make sure that we're adequately planning for that.
If you can share with us what you think the increase in electric car utilization is going to be. It's something that I think everybody kind of scratches their heads about at this point. So
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. I wish I knew that, that I could predict that with any sort of certainty. But, you know, I really think there's a couple of different things that the company is doing to encourage people to adopt. I think, you know, we have a priority on making sure that we're evaluating where to put charging infrastructure and making sure that people, you know, feel comfortable adopting vehicles like that. And so we, you know, you're not getting stranded out somewhere, you know, on Highway 29 or something without charging. That's the route that I take home. So I'm aware of, you know, where there is or is not charging there. So yeah, I mean, I think customers will adopt when they see prices come down. They understand the value proposition of lower maintenance costs and really lower overall total cost of ownership. And then, you know, when range anxiety, you know, making sure that there's enough chargers around to make sure that they feel comfortable driving longer distances. So I don't have like really specific numbers, but I think those three things will kind of drive adoption.
great. Well, thank you. And thank you for taking the time to be with us today, Farah. We really appreciate all your efforts and the good work of your company.
Yeah,
and
thank
with
you
that,
so much.
You bet. With that, we're going to turn to our discussion with our legislative representatives. Today we have with us the chairs of the two energy committees in the legislature, one in the Senate and one in the Assembly. Joining us from the state Senate is Senator Julian Bradley, who is a relatively new member of the legislature, having just been elected in the last cycle, and is new to the chairmanship of the committee. And also joining us is Representative Mike Kuglitsch, who is an old hand at energy issues. He's been chair of the Energy Committee for quite some time and is, you know, very knowledgeable on energy and utility issues. And with that, we're having that's Mike. Mike, maybe you could kick it off since Julian doesn't seem to have joined us quite yet.
Sure. So it says Garrett Hoffman on my name, but actually, yeah, I'm Representative Mike Kuglitsch. So it's good to be with you again, Jim, and your group. I think this is probably my fourth or fifth time that we've had a chat. And I have been doing the energy chair for the Assembly for 8 years, or going on 8 years. So I'm here as a resource for you and your organization. The interesting thing, you just asked the question to Farah, was electric vehicles. And the interesting thing about that, the last time I spoke to your group, we brought that up as from a standpoint of electric vehicles and electrification is coming. And from an investor in utilities, that's a good thing, right? Because you know, with the emphasis now to go to carbon-free electricity, they want to use electrification, which means electric vehicles. Right now, we've got natural gas furnaces. They want to go to electric furnaces. You know, some of that I think is good. Some of it's bad. I think, though, the electric vehicle is probably a good thing. And just to give you some numbers, Jim, and is that Ford global vehicle volume, they believe that they'll be at 40% by 2030. GM has 30 new electric vehicle models will be out by 2025. And I think the game changer in the electric vehicle is that the F-150, which is the #1 selling vehicle in the United States, and it has been for years, will be fully electric F-150 in 2022. So I think that once, you know, your contractors, your rural people hop in a electric F-150, I think you're going to see a lot of other individuals kind of jump on board. So when you look at how that relates to the energy sector, is that all these people are going to either be charging these electric vehicles in their home at night, in their garage, or they're going to be charging them where we go now to a gas station and fill up with gas. They'll be doing that with a fast charger. So from the standpoint of your organization, I think it's bright on the horizon because there's going to be new load or demand for electricity. So just wanted to kind of, you know, put that out there because I know you asked Farah that before. And then I see we've got the good Senator Bradley there. And so Jim, you let me know how you want to handle this with Julie and I, and then we can go from there.
Well, perhaps we could hear from Senator Bradley and then take questions at that point. Senator
Sure.
Bradley, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate your taking the time. I gave a little introduction before you joined us, I guess. So with that, we'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, everybody, and good morning. Thanks for having both Mike and I on here. This is my first one of these, so I'm pretty excited to be able to interact with you guys and really get the opportunity to answer any questions about things that are coming up. This is my first session, and as you know, I'm the chair of the Utilities Committee here in the Senate, and we have been very busy. It has been a really busy session across the board. One of the biggest things that we've been able to do already this session was the PSC omnibus bill from last session that got stalled out in the Senate due to COVID. We were able to pick that back up, and I want to thank all of you for helping me across the board as we had some questions and wanted to be able to push that, and also to my friend Mike Kuglitsch for his assistance in getting that bill up, getting it passed and getting it signed. We were able to take care of that and really address several issues and items. And I know we're already working on other things that we may need to look at for this session, because that was to cover up last session. I came in at the tail end of Mike's remarks. I apologize. Technology issues have still not gotten any easier. We still keep running into some issues, but we're getting there. Even at this point, we're still getting there. But yeah, I heard the tail end of Mike's remarks, and I just want to reiterate that, you know, the world is changing, and the impact on your industry and the industries of technology, and how technology is evolving and changing how the world does business, how the world travels, how we learn, and everything. The utilities and power, electric, et cetera, they are going to be right at the forefront of these, because people often kind of forget who it is that's powering these things and how they're going to work. So these are the things that we're going to continue to be looking at very closely as time goes on, as the session goes on. Obviously, we're finishing up the budget right now, and then, you know, we'll be right back at looking at all the other bills and things that are coming across our desk. But this I just wanted to do my quick introduction and then really open it up for questions from everybody here and see if there's something that we might be able to talk about with you guys.
Let me jump right in with a question. With respect to electric vehicles, charging, being able to charge them on the road is obviously one of the bigger impediments, I think, right now. People have some anxiety about how far you can go in an electric car. And I know there was a proposal in the budget to essentially deregulate the the service station or some, a third-party ownership of charging stations, and that got pulled out. I assume there's going to be separate legislation, or is separate legislation on that subject. I just kind of interested to know what you think and what the plans are there. What I'm talking about again is really just the idea that a third party could sell electricity and not be considered a utility.
Right.
Gas station, for example, that would choose to do that.
Yeah, I haven't seen a bill replacing that piece of legislation yet. Obviously, there's been talk about it because it was in the budget as well. Glad to see majority of the policy items pulled out of the budget. That was one that I'm glad to see. And you know, it raises you talked about regulation. It raises a real interesting point, right? If we're basically have to make a decision if we're going to have a regulated or deregulated, it's got to be one or the other. And I think that's those are going to be the questions that we're going to have to answer if that bill comes up and we take a look at it. But I haven't seen a bill to do that yet. I've heard some chatter about it, but I haven't seen a bill to do it.
Mike, any thoughts on that?
So, you know, what the policy was that was in the budget and what the bill that's out there has to do is, as we talk about electrification, as we talk about electric vehicles, and Jim, you mentioned there's the anxiety of, am I going to run out of juice in my car, and where do I stop to basically recharge? And one of the things in the statute, because of being a regulated state, is that no one else can basically sell electricity to the public, right? So I think this makes sense. All it does is says that, and I'm just going to pull, let's say Quick Trip, right? They have they invest in electric charging station. It just gives them the ability to charge on a kilowatt hour, right? Which is basically how you get charged for a gallon of gas. So it's not competition. You know, when you look at the whole third party, there's two parts to it. It's the first part is generating electricity, and the second part is selling it to the public, right? So I don't see a problem with this bill because basically they're going to be purchasing the electricity from the utilities, and then they just have to come up with a way to be able to sell it, just like they sell gas now. So it's not really an intrusion on the third party or the regulated monopoly that we have. So I see that it will happen and happen soon. They did it in Iowa about 2 years ago. It's just the next step we're going to do to electrification.
Is there I'm sorry to interrupt. Is that a current bill or is that one that's being discussed?
It was in the budget, and I think it's being discussed now to make it happen somehow.
Okay. I just wanted to follow up because I had not seen a specific bill on that. So thank you.
Some have raised sort of the issue of what the upcharge would be for the Quick Trip or whoever chose to do this, and the potential need for some kind of regulation of that. In other words, they buying electricity from their utility at whatever the rate is, and then they're in turn providing it to consumers, but they want to make a buck to cover their costs and have a profit. And what would be, the upcharge for that, I guess, is the question, and how do you sort of keep some lid on that?
So I think there will have to be, and if it's going to be the PSC through basically rate making, I think there's going to have to be some type of cap on margin. And I think now if you equate per gallon, like right now, if you go and fill up your gas and you're paying $3 a gallon, what currently is out there now that is payable is like, if it's electric vehicle, it's about $1.37 per gallon. So it's going to be cost effective, and I think there'll have to be some type of regulation as to the cap on the margin for reselling.
We have some questions from some of our audience. I'm not sure if they can see those or not. Yeah, do you want me to read them?
Yeah, if you can read them.
Sure. Okay. As a follow-up to the electric vehicle discussion, does the legislature have any plans to support or encourage the development of charging infrastructure, particularly in the more rural parts of the state. I guess the implication being, some proactive grant program or something of that nature. Kind of a broadband question, right?
Whoever wants to, Julian, you want to take a crack at that, or else I've got some thoughts?
Yeah, if you have some thoughts, Mike, I'll go ahead and I'll yield to you, and then I can
Okay.
plug anything in.
So there's been $10 million set aside from the VW lawsuit that is basically earmarked for charging infrastructure, charging station infrastructure. I think we'd be idiots to not to take advantage of that $10 million. I think it has to be some type of matching program where it's not just a 100% giveaway, but if there was a match. One of my colleagues, Representative Nealon, had a proposal 2 years ago about creating a EV charging corridor throughout the state, covering I-94 from basically Kenosha to Minneapolis, from Beloit up to Lake Tomahawk. I think that would be a wise way to do it. Now, my personal opinion, I don't want to speak for Julian, but do I think that we should use state tax dollars to subsidize EV charging stations? I don't think that is viable. I think when people put in gas stations, it was a free market, private sector, and I think that's the way it should be done, with free market, private sector for any additional EV charging. Now, that's my opinion. I don't know, your thoughts, Julian?
Yeah, I fully agree. I think that's something that, we can make sure that we're out of the way, get the government out of the way, so that when people are ready to build their charging stations for the expansion of, look, the electric vehicles aren't going away, right? We know that how popular they've become just across the board. People are always looking into things like this, and a big push on green energy, green transportation, green everything. They're not going away. They're becoming stylish now. We know it's going to be a growing market, and we would be counting on the market to create and develop some of these charging stations. It's our responsibility to make sure the government's out of the way so that the market can do its thing. And so I agree with Mike. I want to make sure that we can do our part, and that's what I believe our role would be.
Another question from our audience deals with energy efficiency, and the question is, will the legislature increase the efficiency improvement program of focus on energy? There was a proposal in the budget to double the assessment on utilities for focus on energy, for example, from 1.2 to 2.4% of revenues, which would have generated another $100 million paid for by ratepayers. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on any of that.
I'll start. I haven't, I know it's not in the budget, and at least I believe that was one of the items that was pulled. So this isn't anything I've had a specific conversation on recently. If there's a proposal out there, we're happy to take a look at it. This isn't an issue that I've seen anytime recently.
Yeah, and just, I know Joint Finance pulled this policy out, and they viewed it basically as doubling the energy tax, because everybody pays it and not everybody gets the benefits from it. So I don't foresee that getting any traction soon.
We have another one here having to do with renewable generation. And this one, what can be done to encourage utilities to invest in local renewables, particularly solar, electricity generation and distribution? Again, looking for, this particular individual is looking for some discussion on the potential to encourage distributed generation of solar and such. Any thoughts on that?
It's kind of, Jim, that's kind of a nebulous statement. Can you a little bit more specific?
Well, I think the questioner is wondering whether there would be interest on the part of the legislature in having programs that would encourage individual solar installations on a distributed basis on people's houses and what have you, as opposed to utility scale solar, but it would presumably involve some kind of a matching grants or tax credits or something of that nature to encourage it.
And Julian, I'm not really sure what they're asking. So if you've got a thought on that.
I don't at this time. Again, solar's come up quite a bit, right? We've had a lot of conversations regarding solar. Regarding the question and a proposal to encourage, again, that's not something I've been privy to so far this session, nor has it been part of any conversations I've had. So as far as whether or not there's an appetite in the legislature, nothing has made its way to my desk. I don't know if Mike, you've had any conversations yet either, but nothing's made its way to my desk. Nobody's pinged me to say, hey, would you be open to, or what are your thoughts on? So at this point, I don't believe there's been anything, at least of any detail or any detailed conversations that has gotten us in that direction.
And I think, Jim, the only thing I can kind of add to that is that I think if you look at what's been proposed and what's actually being developed now, there is a lot of solar in the state that is happening, being developed now and proposed to happen in the future. I think a lot of these are large utility solar, and because it's basically the economies of scale and scaling, the larger creates the more affordable electricity. And the one thing I know that the more distributed and smaller you go, the more expensive it is to create that electron. And at the end of the day, are we trying to reduce carbon emissions and use solar, then let's do it in the most economic way and the most efficient way. And those are the larger solar farms, I'll call them, or programs. So that's, without knowing exactly the question, that's, I guess, the best answer I can give.
The question from me, I guess, in sort of in that same context is, there is apparently legislation floating around that might be introduced shortly that would start to deregulate third-party ownership of solar facilities, get them out from under PSC regulation. And it would, I assume is aimed at, creating more distributed solar generation. I'm just curious if you've heard or seen anything about that legislation or have any opinions about it. I mean, I think I know your answer, but.
So are you talking about community solar?
Community solar, I think there was another proposal that was just flat out creating an exception to PSC regulation for third-party owned solar as well. So they're similar in a sense.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I look at it and say, what do people, what's their objective, right? If they want less carbon, and if it's solar and wind, then let's do that. But right now, the state of Wisconsin is a regulated utility state, right? So if we're looking at doing things that don't work in that framework, I mean, then we're looking at a big question of how do we do that? And if that's deregulation, well, then that's a whole different argument, right? That's a bigger conversation than saying, let's allow a third party to do community solar. I mean, the fact is that utilities have community solar now. They have large solar farms, and my concern is, and your previous speaker talked about reliability. I mean, my big question still is, when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, when we turn our light on and it doesn't go on, that's one thing. But what about the industries that can't turn on their shops? And so reliability and affordability is still my two big things. And and you look at, I think you brought up Texas earlier. You got to realize Texas is a deregulated state, and a lot of the sins that happened, in their blackout and outages is because when you don't have a regulated state, reliability will take a hit because it's all based off of costs, right? So people cut corners. And we found out that when you have a winter storm like Texas isn't used to, and people have cut corners, guess what? You don't have good results.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of jump on with that. When I first did my remarks, that was one of the things I was talking about, right? Is the regulation versus deregulation and creating exceptions. And like Mike, I have my two top priorities are reliability and affordability, right? We need to make sure we're taking care of our ratepayers and that they're getting what they're expecting, which is ensuring that they get the power and energy that they need. So those are going to continue to be our top priorities. And as Mike said, the issue of regulated versus deregulated is essentially what happens when you introduce this bill. It might be thought of, well, it's just creating an exception. It's not. It actually is bringing in a much bigger, broader question that we would have to address and further legislation. So I think that hopefully answers your question, where both of us are on this one.
Also on the renewable front, part of what's necessary to make the system work with an increased emphasis on renewables is to be able to bring it in from distances. In other words, the wind's not blowing here, but it's blowing in South Dakota. We need to be able to bring in electricity from South Dakota. But that requires, expanding distribution or transmission lines. And we run up against sort of local opposition to all of that. So you kind of have the desire for more renewable energy being stymied by, opposition to these transmission lines by local individuals. And we're kind of wondering whether as a result, they're in court all the time, and you're having judges making these decisions, second guessing the decisions of the PSC. Do you think the legislature has any interest in weighing in on this a little further and maybe strengthening the hand of those that are trying to build the necessary transmission lines?
Well, I'll tell you what, I would not want to get into the way of local government or local citizens' concerns, right? I think they have to have a recourse to use the judicial system. That's what it's there for. However, with that being said, the irony of this is that the same individuals that are promoting and pushing for renewable energy are the same individuals, the hypocrisy, are now fighting the transmission line that is bringing the wind from the plains, so it's the irony of that is just, it just baffles me. But it's kind of like, hey, I love this, but not in my backyard. So, and I don't think that the state should get heavy-handed, because I think these individuals should have the ability to use, the courts as as recourse. But at the end of the day, the irony of the whole thing is just baffles me.
Indeed. Well, that pretty much uses up our time this morning. And I want to thank you both for taking the time. Senator Bradley and Representative Kuglitsch, this was very, very informative. I really appreciate all your work and for your willingness to be with us this morning. And with that, we're going to call it a day and adjourn our day in the Capitol, our virtual day in the Capitol meeting. And hopefully this will be the last time we have to meet virtually.
Hey, Jim, we hope so too. We are just done with Zoom. So
Yes,
Right.
very much so. Can't wait to see you guys in person. Thank you so much, guys.
Indeed.
all right,
Take
have a
care.
good day.